Well, good afternoon on this Thursday, August 20th. Just to realize that today is at sundown, the Muslim world separates Muharram rather. It is actually the first day of their new year in their calendar. And so, it's just an opportunity if you have Muslim friends, to identify where they are in their faith and in what they understand about what's going on. I think part of us identifying with people and reaching out to people, showing them kindness, is just to identify with where they may be, and so. The whole point of this time for them, that Muharram actually means prohibited, forbidden, and so it is about them, restricting themselves from certain things. It's actually a month where they are encouraged not to participate in warfare. Interestingly enough. And yet it's also a time of reflection and celebration as well. The same way that we think of December 31st, the August 20th this year, in the Muslim calendar is their New Year's Eve, if you will. And so, just a point of knowledge for you, or again, you know a Muslim person, to wish them a happy Muharram today, and I think it's even it's appropriate even for the next month, because it is kind of a month-long celebration. But anyways, we are going through the Beattitudes today, and looking. We won't finish it up today, I assure you. But we are in the last Beatitude. I think in some ways the most challenging, the most counterintuitive, the one that requires the most faith from us. But here Jesus says, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." And so it's just important to recognize that again, how counterintuitive that is, that, we're blessed, God's favor, the resulting joy that would come from that comes from when we are persecuted. And, I think that's, important for us to understand in terms of these behaviors that Jesus is encouraging. Now, it is significant to recognize that, as Jesus says, blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And that same promise and that same reward is given in verse 3 in the beginning of the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. That is called an inclusio. And so that would be a technique that writers or speakers would use to show that this is intended to be a unit, that even though Jesus will go on, even in expressing more about this last Beatitude as well as going into the Sermon on the Mount, he intends for these character principles to be a unit in and of themselves by doing that. And so, again, an important thing to remember. And I just like Jesus' honesty in this. When he recognizes how the world is going to be against him, that he is not welcoming us to a rose garden. He's not welcoming us to a situation where peace is going to be easy. That as we represent Jesus, as we share the gospel, as we share our faith, the world is going to be against us. As he shares in John 17, in the same way that they hated me, they will hate you. And so Jesus is being honest about that. In fact, persecution is a pretty primary theme in the Gospel of Matthew. The thought is that as Matthew is writing his gospel, he may be writing to a group of people that were experiencing persecution, so he wanted to make sure that he emphasized the words that Jesus shared in relation to that showed God's favor being on those that are persecuted. Again, as we're suffering in the world, as we're suffering the hardship that comes from following Christ, God wants to remind us that, again, he looks on that favorably, and as much as persecution is a main emphasis in Matthew, the whole idea of reward is also a primary emphasis in the Gospel of Matthew. And so the resultant reward that God points us to, that he is certainly going to make it worth it for us in terms of what the promise comes in heaven, even the promise that comes in this life. in terms of experience a greater power of God, a greater presence of God as we stand for him and we're willing to be persecuted. And so, again, it's just so good to see that Jesus is showing his integrity by being honest with us. That yeah, when you stand for me, you're not going to win the popularity contest. And so just realize that. Another thing to recognize in terms of what Jesus is saying here is that we are persecuted because of righteousness' sake, or no, we can be persecuted for a lot of things, but the thing that brings blessing on our life is when we are being persecuted for righteousness' sake. I think it's in the book of Hebrews, or maybe it's Timothy, I can't even remember, what it says, so if you live a righteous life, you will be persecuted. I think that's Paul's reflection of what Jesus is saying here. And yet, what that means is if you're being persecuted for unrighteousness, well, then that's not something that God will bless. If you're, being self-righteous, you're being judgmental, if you're being offensive in the way that you're presenting the gospel, you're living your life out for Jesus, and you're being persecuted for that, that's not something that God will bless. But when we're being righteous, when we're representing Jesus in a fitting way, when we are sharing the gospel and representing that truth of Christ, that's what God will honor. That's what Jesus is saying will be blessed. Now, it is also interesting too that when it says here in verse 10, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness," and then in verse 11, Jesus expands that, gives further explanation about that. It's the only beatitude where Jesus does that, where he adds an addendum. And I think that's because of the challenge that exists in this beatitude in terms of us following it. But it's also interesting that Jesus associated that persecution not only with righteousness, but also standing for him. So it says here in verse 11, "Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me." So in the same way that we're persecuted because of righteousness, we're also persecuted when we stand for Jesus. And that certainly associates the kind of people that Jesus is encouraging us, that those things are synonymous, that when we're living our life for Jesus, we're also living a life of righteousness and what we're presenting and we're proposing in people's lives. And so, again, that is going to be an offense to the world. We'll get into why that is, not today, but a little later. But here, just focusing on what is being honored by Christ is, again, this righteousness. It's standing for the gospel, and again, that is offensive in and of itself. So we don't have to be offensive as we're sharing it. I think it's also important to recognize that this is very different than what would be encouraged in other world religions. When the statement is made, okay, you rid the world of the infidel, or again, you go and you sacrifice yourself, and there is the promise of heaven. Blow up people and blow yourself up and take people with you, and there is the promise of heaven. This is very different in terms of what Christ encourages. What marks a believer in Jesus is, again, we love those, we love our enemies, we are blessed when we accept persecution, when we don't return evil for evil, we return good for evil. And but again, that's the character of Christ. That's what Christ is encouraging in our life. And as I always say, when God encourages us to be something, he's also empowering that. When we recognize the possibility, the ability that we have to be blessed, to be righteous, even in the presence of persecution, and to recognize that just the hope, the joy, the peace that comes because of that, because that God is showing his favor towards this thing, that's a great aspect of what defines us as believers in terms of what Jesus is saying, like how we interact with this persecution. And just realize that, again, living for Jesus and being righteous is going to be synonymous in terms of what he's encouraging. I think it's also important to recognize that even though I think Jesus primarily is talking about a persecution that would lead to physical harm, I think that when we recognize the persecution that the church has suffered throughout the history of the world, well, a lot of times that has been the case. In terms of just the physical suffering, the death that people have died for the sake of Christ, even what's happening in our modern time in different parts of the world. I don't think that we should expect that in our lifetime that might happen here, but that's the nature of the sacrifice that God would call us to in representing Jesus, in representing righteousness. But he also expands that in verse 11, in terms of, again, what is the nature of the persecution? What's the kind of things that will come our way when we're representing Jesus, when we're standing for the gospel, when we're sharing our faith with other people? Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. So we shouldn't be surprised when that happens. Shouldn't be surprised when people misrepresent us, when they misrepresent, the truth of Christ, or they misrepresent the gospel. It's something that is interesting when you look at the first century, that the Christian community was actually persecuted for the fact that they were cannibals. When the world heard, what Jesus communicated about eat my flesh and drink my blood. The bread is my body, that the cup, the wine, the grape juice is my blood. Again, misrepresenting that truth, misrepresenting what the beliefs were said, but again, they were persecuted because of that. And so sometimes the persecution won't even be because of the truth that you're presenting, but it's because of the wrong perception that people have about the truth. But it's all that Jesus is saying, but we're blessed. Again, like he's saying, expect it. Don't be surprised when it comes. And rather than retaliating in the presence of it, rather than avoiding it, rather than not speaking the truth and not sharing the gospel because of what might come from the world, no, we continue to do that. We have to remember that God is always the reference point in terms of just what kind of people we are, what kind of things we say. We don't base what we do on the reaction that comes from people, particularly in this area, again, when we're representing righteousness, when we're standing for the gospel, when we're living for Christ, when we're even identifying with Christ and the work that he has done in our life. I think that's a primary thing that we do is just sharing, just the blessing, the good news that we have in terms of just what our life is, because of what Christ has done for us, the personal testimony we have of that. And then to the extent that translates to other people, we look for open doors for the gospel. We look for open doors of people that need to hear or want to hear or looking for that truth. And we take the risk. We recognize that sometimes when we share the gospel, when we stand for righteousness, again, people may not receive that well, but that's part of the package. And we just understand that in God's economy, we're blessed because of that. And that is, the ways that rewards happen oftentimes in the scripture is that as we're being persecuted, we might feel like we're losing reputation, we're losing friends, we're being disregarded by people. And that's hard. That's uncomfortable for us. But then God comes along and says, blessed are you, and because of that, you receive the kingdom of heaven. The way rewards work is that's God's compensation. That is the return. That is the balance that God gives. That actually is not a balance. It doesn't make it equal. That what God gives is greater than that. But that's what we bring into that persecution. I think we all recognize this. I think we all recognize the disdain that sometimes comes from those that don't believe the gospel and don't believe in Jesus, and we might share our faith. We might ask them a question. We might just talk about, what God is doing in our life, but, what'd you do this weekend? They did this, and they tell their thing, and you talk, well, I went to church, and it was a great message, or, God really taught me this about myself, or about how I should be, or, whatever it might be that we're representing the truth of Christ. And I think we recognize how uncomfortable that makes people. How we recognize how, sometimes there is retaliation for that. And we just need to make sure that we don't let that affect what we do, that we operate according to the wisdom that comes from God. Again, we're not offensive in the way we present the gospel. I think we are wise as serpents and meek as doves. We are strategic in the way we do things when it comes to unbelievers, but we just don't operate in fear. That we don't let fear be the thing that dictates whether or not we speak, whether or not we share the gospel, but just what is going to be the best to promote the gospel in someone else's life. And so it's interesting, even the balance that exists when God says, go be the friend of sinners, be a peacemaker, live at peace with people, and yet realize that you're going to be presenting something to people that is confrontational, that they're going to react and they're going to persecute you because of this. And that's kind of the balance that oftentimes exists in what we live out in the Christian life, and where that discernment is needed, where that closeness with God is needed, where we have this engaged relationship with the Word and with the Spirit, with prayer. So as we're going forward and we're speaking the truth in love, and we're representing Jesus, we're recognizing God is with us, that we're following his dictates about walking through open doors, trying to turn some knobs in terms of asking questions or representing the gospel to people. And again, God is the leader. God is the one who is orchestrating that, and certainly directed by the objectivity of his word as well in terms of that. But as we're receiving that persecution from man, we should just recognize the encouragement that is in our heart, because again, God calls this blessed, that God honors this, and there's reward that comes to us. Well, that's, I think, enough for today in terms of just trying to unpack this last beatitude. Just realize that next week I will be not here, and so I know it's been kind of strange the way I've orchestrated my vacation time this summer, trying to be here for as many Sundays as I could, and so so it did affect my daily videos more than I would have wanted, but we'll recognize that's either the way to do it or not do it next year. But anyways, the reality is that I won't be here next week. I will be here Sunday, but then Spencer McComb will be covering for me on August 30th. Just hope that these Beatitudes, again, are encouraging you, are just showing God's direction and just what he's desiring of our lives. And even when we're challenged, even when this, again, is something that we maybe would most not want to do, we recognize that standing for Christ is worth it, that the gospel is worth it, the good news is worth it, the transformation that can come in other people's lives, the value that they ultimately could see in the truth of Christ is worth it as well. So God bless you in your day today.